In the year 917, a woman leading an army of thousands stormed one of the most heavily fortified Danish strongholds in England and took it in a single assault. She had already built 10 fortified towns from nothing, renegotiated alliances with the Welsh kingdoms, and coordinated a two-front military campaign across hundreds of miles with her brother, the King of Wessex. The following year, the Kingdom of York, the last great Viking stronghold in northern England, sent envoys to submit to her. Not to her brother. To her. She died before she could accept their surrender. And today, almost no one knows her name. First, we need to understand who Æthelflæd of Mercia actually was, and why the official history of England erased her. Then, the world she was born into, and what she built inside it. Then, the single most consequential military and political achievement of her era, and who got the credit. And finally, why getting this wrong doesn't just misrepresent a woman. It misrepresents how England itself came to exist. Here is what the standard Anglo-Saxon history looks like in almost every textbook. Alfred the Great saves England from the Vikings. His son, Edward the Elder, continues the campaign. His grandson, Æthelflæd, unifies the country and becomes the first king of England. Father, son, grandson. Somewhere between Alfred and Æthelflæd, a neat, clean dynastic line of great men, a woman named Æthelflæd appears as a footnote. Alfred's eldest child. Edward's sister. A helpful ally on the northern flank. One chapter. A paragraph. A sentence. She is described, when described at all, as the Lady of the Mercians, which sounds like a title of decoration rather than command. She is rarely called a queen. She is almost never called a general. She is never called the architect of English unification. And yet that is precisely what she was. The mechanism of her erasure is specific, documented, and deliberate. After Æthelflæd died in 918, her brother Edward moved immediately. He seized her kingdom of Mercia within months. Her daughter and heir, Alfwine, was deposed and removed to Wessex, probably to a nunnery. The independent kingdom of Mercia ceased to exist. The official history of England was then written by West Saxon scribes, loyal to Edward's dynasty. Their primary source, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, downplays Æthelflæd at every turn. The historian F.T. Wainwright, who spent decades on this question, concluded in the mid-20th century that she was deliberately minimized in West Saxon sources because recognizing her achievements would have encouraged Mercian separatism and complicated the narrative of West Saxon supremacy. There is a second document, a fragmented Mercian text called the Annals of Æthelflæd, sometimes called the Mercian Register, that tells a completely different story. But it survived only in pieces, absorbed into later chronicles that Wessex controlled. The winners wrote the history, and the winners needed Mercia erased. Without Æthelflæd in the story, the unification of England looks like a straightforward West Saxon conquest, one man extending his father's work down a dynastic line. What it actually was a military and political partnership across two kingdoms. Edward could not have held the south while simultaneously pushing north without Æthelflæd holding the entire Midlands. The fortifications she built, the alliances she maintained, the campaigns she personally led, these were not support functions. They were the campaign. Remove her and the story becomes simpler, more inevitable, more male. It also becomes wrong. To understand what Æthelflæd achieved, you have to understand what England looked like in the 870s, when she was born. It barely existed. The map of Britain was a patchwork of kingdoms being consumed one by Scandinavian invaders. East Anglia, gone. Northumbria, gone. The eastern half of Mercia, gone, partitioned into what the English called the Danelaw. The kingdom of Wessex, in the south, barely surviving. Alfred the Great, Æthelflæd's father, had spent the decade of the 870s in a state of near-constant crisis. In 878, Vikings attacked his palace at Chippenham in the dead of winter. Alfred fled into the Somerset marshes with his family, including his eldest daughter, approximately 8 years old. Æthelflæd grew up as a hunted child in a kingdom under siege. This was the education that made her. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into the popular accounts. Before Æthelflæd became the sole ruler of Mercia, she appeared in 4 charters, official legal documents, as a co-signatory alongside her husband. This sounds minor. It is not. Prior to Æthelflæd, Mercian queens appear in only 3 out of 49 surviving charters across the entire previous history of the kingdom. For appearances in a single reign, before she even ruled alone, was unprecedented for any woman in Mercian history. She was not waiting to inherit power. She was already exercising it, openly, in the official record, while her husband still lived. The Mercian political class recognized her authority in ink, not just in practice. Around 886, when Æthelflæd was in her mid-teens, her father Alfred arranged her marriage to Æthelred of Mercia. Æthelred was not a king. He held the title of Lord of the Mercians, the alderman, or governor, of the western half of a kingdom whose eastern half was under Danish control. He had accepted Alfred's overlordship, and this marriage was Alfred's way of formalizing that alliance in blood. It was a calculated political move. 2 kingdoms needed to function as one if the Vikings were to be driven out. The marriage was the binding mechanism. What Alfred perhaps did not calculate was that his daughter would eventually run one of those kingdoms better than anyone had run it in a generation. To understand what Æthelflæd actually built, we need to talk about the bø. A bø, the Old English word from which we get the modern word borough, was a fortified town, purpose-built as a defensive node in a network. Alfred had pioneered the concept in Wessex. Towns spaced roughly 30 miles apart, each ringed by defensive walls and manned by a permanent garrison. The idea was simple. Viking raiders moved fast and lived off terror. A network of fortified positions meant they could never penetrate deep into territory without leaving a fortified town at their backs. Alfred's innovation worked in Wessex. But Mercia had no such network. Its borders were exposed, its interior undefended, and its eastern flank occupied by an enemy who had held that territory for decades. Building a network in Mercia meant constructing fortresses in contested land, sometimes directly adjacent to Danish-held territory. It meant engineering, logistics, garrison recruitment, and political negotiation, all simultaneously, in a kingdom that had spent 2 generations being dismembered. Æthelflæd built 10 of them in 8 years, while simultaneously leading military campaigns and managing diplomatic relations with Wales, Ireland, Norway, and her brother's kingdom to the south. The 12th century chronicler William of Malmesbury described her as a woman of enlarged soul, who was the delight of her subjects, the dread of her enemies. He was not speaking metaphorically. Æthelred died in 911. He had been incapacitated by illness for nearly a decade. Æthelflæd had been the effective ruler of Mercia for most of that time. When he died, the Mercian nobility faced a choice that had no precedent in Anglo-Saxon history. Their lord was gone. His wife, a West Saxon princess, technically, was the most capable person in the room. They chose her. The historian Ian Walker described her formal accession as one of the most unique events in early medieval history. In Wessex, women were not permitted to hold political office. Alfred's own wife had never been granted the title of queen. In Mercia, the tradition was different. Mercian queens had witnessed charters, held authority, and acted in their own names. Æthelflæd was the beneficiary of that tradition. She was given the title Mercna Hladij, Lady of the Mercians. There was no template for a lone female ruler, so they gave her the highest title available and let her work. She immediately began building fortresses. Before we get to the campaign that changed England, there is a battle from earlier in her tenure that reveals exactly what kind of leader she was. When a combined force of Danes, Norsemen, and Irish descended on Chester, one of the most valuable towns in the Mercian northwest, they came prepared for a prolonged siege. What they encountered instead was psychological warfare of a high order. According to an Irish chronicle called The Three Fragments, Æthelflæd arranged for a group of Irish soldiers among her allies to approach the Viking besiegers and offer to defect. The Vikings accepted. The Irish led them into a prepared position, and the Mercians cut them down. She also, reportedly, ordered defenders to drop beehives from the town walls onto the besieging forces. Whether you attribute every tactical detail to her personally or to her commanders, the result is the same: A numerically superior besieging force was repelled by a combination of misdirection, ambush, and improvised weaponry. Irish chronicles from the period call her Queen of the Saxons. That was not her official title. It was what foreign observers chose to call her based on what they actually saw. Then came 917. Working in coordination with her brother Edward pushing north from Wessex, Æthelflæd launched the Mercian campaign that would shatter the southern Danelaw. She moved first on Derby, a major Danish borough built on the site of an old Roman fort. The assault was costly. 4 of her personal thanes, her closest military companions, were killed fighting through the gates. She took the city anyway. In 918, Leicester submitted without a siege. The Danes there chose negotiation over battle, a testament to the reputation she had built. And then, in 918, came the moment that even the West Saxon Chronicle could not entirely suppress. York, the Viking capital of the north, the seat of a Scandinavian kingdom that had held England's most important city for over 40 years, sent envoys to Æthelflæd. They offered submission. Not to Edward. Not to Wessex. To her. The kingdom of Northumbria, the final and greatest prize of the reconquest, was hers to claim. She died on the 12th of June, 918, at Tamworth, the ancient seat of the Mercian kings, before she could accept that submission. Edward moved into Mercia within months. He absorbed the submission of York in his own name. His daughter, Æthelflæd's, was removed to Wessex and disappeared from the record. And the victory that Æthelflæd had made possible was written into history as Edward's triumph. The Mercian nobility tried to resist. They named Æthelflæd's daughter Alfwine as their new lady of the Mercians. It lasted less than a year before Edward dissolved the title and annexed the kingdom. Alfwine was removed, quietly, firmly, permanently. She spent the rest of her life, as far as historians can tell, confined to a nunnery in Wessex, where she would pose no threat to the West Saxon claim on her mother's kingdom. The Mercian Register, the document that recorded Æthelflæd's actual achievements, survived only in fragments, absorbed into versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle edited by scribes working under West Saxon royal patronage. The history of England was not lost. It was reorganized. The modern reappraisal of Æthelflæd began in earnest with the scholar F.T. Wainwright, whose 1959 essay, Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, remains one of the foundational texts in the field. Wainwright systematically cross-referenced the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's accounts with the surviving fragments of the Mercian Register and external Irish and Welsh sources, and concluded that the West Saxon Chronicle had not simply neglected Æthelflæd, it had structurally suppressed her. His central argument, the success of Edward's campaigns against the Danes depended, to a great extent, upon Æthelflæd's cooperation. In the Midlands and the North, she came to dominate the political scene. And she used her influence to make the unification of England possible, under kings who then minimized her in the record. More recent scholarship, including work by the historian Ian Walker and archaeologists studying the network, has confirmed the picture. Æthelflæd's fortifications were not peripheral contributions. They were the load-bearing structure of the entire reconquest strategy. Without the Mercian network she built, Edward's advance north would have had no secure western flank. The conventional narrative was not just incomplete. It was architecturally inverted. Æthelflæd was not Alfred's helpful daughter or Edward's cooperative sister. She was the co-architect of English unification, operating as a head of state, a military commander, and a strategic planner in her own right, over a kingdom larger than the one her brother inherited. The difference is not a matter of emphasis. It is the difference between calling someone a footnote and calling them what the evidence says, a sovereign who commanded armies, built cities, and made the creation of England possible, and who was then erased, in real time, by the dynasty she helped put in power. The story of Æthelflæd is not really about Æthelflæd. It is about what happens when a political structure is built on the labor of someone whose continued existence threatens the legitimacy of the people who benefited from that labor. This happened to Æthelflæd. The kingdom of Mercia ceased to exist the moment it was no longer useful to the West Saxon dynasty she had helped elevate. Her daughter disappeared. Her records were fragmented. Her title, unique in Anglo-Saxon history, was never claimed again. It happened to the Mercian register, a primary source, written by people who lived through the events, absorbed and edited by the side that won. It is happening, right now, to dozens of historical figures in every region on Earth where the dominant historical record was compiled by the successors of people who had reason to minimize what came before. The pattern has a name. We just rarely recognize it until someone goes back to look for the documents that survived. History did not forget Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians. History was written by the dynasty she built England for, and they needed her forgotten. Now you know.